This is a continuing series of videos on hermeneutics, the art and science of how to interpret the Bible correctly. By me, I'm Dr. Joe Sprinkle, and we're in the general category of special hermeneutics. And the video today is going to be on apocalyptic, especially Daniel and Revelation. Some of the most fascinating and difficult portions of the Bible are the apocalyptic portions. And these portions include two entire books, the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation. Now, you might ask the question, what exactly is apocalyptic? Well, more liberal Bible scholars generally see apocalyptic as an entirely distinct category from the genre of prophecy. Conservative scholars, in contrast, generally see apocalyptic as a subcategory of prophecy, or prophecy with certain distinctive characteristics. George Ladd used the term prophetic apocalyptic to distinguish this more conservative approach from the liberal view of apocalyptic, which basically argues that apocalyptic is not historical and not genuine predictive prophecy. The contrast shows up in the analysis of Daniel, where more liberal scholars see the book as a work of fiction whose prophecies are merely a literary guise, whereas conservatives see Daniel as a real person who made genuine predictions of the future that actually came true. The book of Revelation is the paradigm for apocalyptic. When you ask, what is apocalyptic? Well, the book of Revelation, which is also known as the Apocalypse of John, is the prime example of the genre. Any book or portion of book that resembles the book of Revelation can be categorized as apocalyptic. Of course, that's a little bit general, but that's at least gets you in the ballpark. In the Bible, there are certain books that are categorized as apocalyptic, such as the book of Daniel, the book of Revelation, the Olivet Discourse, which is Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21. Paul's Thessalonian epistles are sometimes called apocalyptic, and parts of prophetic books in the Old Testament, like Isaiah 24 through 27, as well as parts of Ezekiel and Zechariah, are sometimes labeled apocalyptic. There were also many extra-biblical writings written mostly from 200 BC to AD 200 that can be categorized as apocalyptic, such as 1st and 2nd Enoch, the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, the Apocalypse of Baruch, the Genesis Apocryphon, Jubilees, among others. And these sought to imitate the style of Daniel and Revelation. So what are some features of apocalyptic? While scholars don't entirely agree as to what are distinctive features of apocalyptic, other than the vague statement that they all resemble the book of Revelation, the list that I have here does give commonly cited features of the genre after D.S. Russell, the method and message of Jewish apocalyptic. So you tend to have esoteric revelations. These are revelations that emphasize the revealing of a mystery to a small group, esoteric revelations. 2, you have highly symbolic and apocalyptic is highly symbolic and figurative. Apocalyptic is kind of like an impressionistic painting whose details make little sense, and yet the whole is relatively clear. So for example, you have Revelation 14 verse 20 that says that the blood of Armageddon will be to the horse's bridle in death and run a distance of 200 miles. Well, this is surely hyperbole, but poor interpreters will take the language literally without a blink of the eye And so you have to understand there's a lot of symbolic language and figurative language in apocalyptic. Apocalyptic is also overtly supernatural. It's filled with visions, with the presence of heavenly interpreters and the like. And then there are two presuppositions in apocalyptic, two theological themes. One is that the present situation is hopeless, but then two, that God is transcendent and sovereign. And those two premises work themselves out together in a very complicated way. And so if the present situation is hopeless, but God is transcendent and sovereign, well, then you would have to say that, well, this age is totally lost and irredeemable. The only hope is in heaven alone. And if God is transcendent and sovereign, well, that leads to the teaching about determinism. Since all that happens is in accord with the will of God, he will accomplish his will regardless of man. You also get dualism. There's a stark contrast between good and evil, God and the world, the present age and the age to come. And apocalyptic is looking for that future age to come. Angels are also prominent in apocalyptic. Since God is transcendent, he cannot have direct dealings with men. Rather, he distances himself from men using angelic mediators. You also have the theme of the ultimate victory of the kingdom of God. Apocalyptic writers look forward to God's raising the final curtain and being victorious over all forms of evil and bringing the age to a conclusion. There's also the idea of imminence. Apocalyptic says, in effect, that the culmination of the present age is imminent and impending. Things are so bad that they cannot get worse, but don't fear, because the end of the world is near. That's the theme of apocalyptic. Apocalyptic portrays the new kingdom as right around the brink of arrival. And then there's the cosmic stage. The sun, the moon, the stars are often involved in the final judgment associated with God's victory over the universe. And then you have the idea of judgment, the last judgment, that those who have oppressed God's people, those who have rebelled against God will get their due judgment in the end. And that's the characteristics of apocalyptic. And as we said, you have biblical apocalyptic, Daniel and Revelation, and parts of prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Zechariah, and also the Olivet Discourse, and Paul's Thessalonian epistles, but also extra biblical apocalyptic, as we also mentioned, First and Second Enoch, Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, the Apocalypse of Baruch, Dead Sea Scroll, the Genesis Apocryphon is apocalyptic in genre, Jubilees, and there are other writings as well. Some of these extra biblical ones predate the New Testament and have influenced the genre, although other ones were written after the New Testament and are simply influenced by biblical apocalyptic. But unlike biblical apocalyptic, these apocalyptic works are often synonymous. That is, they claim to be written by someone who did not actually write them. So how is it that we can interpret apocalyptic, and while we're at it, we'll say at the same time, symbolism in prophetic visions? So how do we interpret apocalyptic imagery and symbolism? Well, when you have a symbolism, you should look for the vision's self-interpretation. If you're lucky, the text will actually stop and tell you what it is that you're seeing. So, for example, in Zechariah chapter 5, you have a vision. And in that vision, it says, then the cover of lead was raised over a basket that was described earlier. And there in the basket sat a woman. And he said, the interpreting angel that is, this is wickedness. And he pushed her back into the basket and pushed the lead cover down over its mouth. And so here you have the text giving us a self-interpretation. That is, that this woman stands for wickedness. Now, with this one hint, you can attempt to make sense of the whole vision. The plan was for God to remove wickedness from Judah and send it back to Babylonia, as it goes on to say, where they worship idols, a place of wickedness. And this is symbolized by the female angels taking the basket described here and the woman wickedness therein to Babylon. So self-interpretation is the starting point. Likewise, you have in Daniel chapter 7 a vision of 4 beasts that came out of the sea. But then the interpreting angel gives us a hint as to what it might mean. It says that the 4 great beasts are 4 kingdoms that will arise on the earth. And once we know that the 4 beasts represent 4 kingdoms, well, then we can see if we can figure out what the kingdoms might be. A next principle, fit the vision into the book's purposes. One question that one should ask of a vision is, what is the overall goal and purpose of the book that contains this vision? In other words, you should try to fit the symbolism into the book's general purpose. So, for example, if you're reading Zechariah chapters 1 through 6, which has a series of highly symbolic, apocalyptic-like visions, it's actually a series of 8 night visions. And when you read these visions as a whole, you find that, well, it emphasizes 2 political leaders of the day, Zerubbabel, the governor, and Joshua, the high priest. And the overall thrust of the message of chapters 1 through 6 is that Zerubbabel and Joshua should rebuild the temple to renew Judah's worship. And each vision in this section contributes to that ultimate goal. And once you get the overall purpose, then it becomes much easier to find significance in each one of the visions. Another thing that you can do is compare visions that are similar to the vision that you happen to be looking at. For example, if we were looking at Daniel's vision in chapter 7 of 4 beasts that are to come out of the sea, and each one, we're told by the self-interpretation that the 4 beasts represent 4 kingdoms that will arise on the earth, but then you have to figure out, well, what are those 4 kingdoms? Well, it turns out that Daniel 7, the vision of the beast from the sea, can be read in conjunction with Daniel 2, a vision of a statue of 4 types of material. Each one of the parts of the statue, the head of the gold and the shoulders of silver and the thighs of bronze and the legs of iron, also represent kingdoms that will arise on the earth. But we have a help in Daniel chapter 2, because it identifies the first of those 4 kingdoms, the head of gold in the statue, as Nebuchadnezzar, basically the Babylonian kingdom led by Nebuchadnezzar. And so from there, you can guess that, well, maybe the first beast that comes out of the sea is also Babylon as well. And so that comparison can help us in interpretation. Later on, we see in Daniel chapter 13 that Daniel will pick up on the vision of Daniel 7, which describes 4 beasts coming out of the sea. although in this case, it kind of combines all the elements of the four beasts of Daniel into one vision. And so you have to interpret Revelation chapter 13 in the light of your understanding of Daniel chapter 7, because it's picking up the imagery and presumably some of the meanings that are found in Daniel. And so again, you need to compare similar visions, and in comparison with each other, they may be illuminating in both directions. Another thing you can do when you have a vision is that you should seek the vision's one main points. Now, visions have lots of details, some of which may be difficult to understand. But if you can figure out the one main point, even where the other details may be obscure, that one main point can establish the primary meaning of the vision. So let me give you an example in Zechariah chapter 1, 18 through 21. There it says, "And I lifted up my eyes, and I looked, and behold, there were four horns." Probably means animals that had horns, but there were four horns. "And so I said to the angel who was speaking to me, what are these?" And he answered me, "These are the horns that have scattered Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem." But then the Lord showed me four craftsmen. And I said, "What are these coming to do?" And he said, "These are the horns which scattered Judah so that no man can lift up his head. But these craftsmen have come to terrify them, to throw down the horns of the nations who have lifted up their horns against the land of Judah in order to scatter it." Now, if you looked at that vision, what would you say is the one main point? Well, the horns seem to represent nations. The horns of the nations, it's called towards the end. They have scattered Judah, but they're going to be thrown down in such a way so that they will no longer be able to continue to do so in the future. So the main point is that the forces that terrorize Judah are going to lose their strength, horns being symbolic of that strength. Now, once you've established that main point, well, then you can go on to ask, well, what about some of the secondary points? Whether the four horns represent four particular nations, such as Egypt and Assyria, Babylon and Persia, or whether the number has no specific notion. To answer these kind of secondary questions, and also another one, who are the craftsmen? Why are there four craftsmen and four horns? Those questions are secondary, but if you can get the main point, even if you're unable to resolve some of the secondary points, you still get the gist of what the vision was about. So that's how you can interpret visions by looking for the book's self-interpretation, fitting a vision into the context and the book's purpose, comparing similar visions elsewhere, and seeking the one main point of each vision. Now, the other thing in terms of the hermeneutics of apocalyptic that I need to mention has to do with millennial views. The millennium, the doctrine of the millennium, has to do with the 1,000 years of Revelation chapter 20. And it's been a debated questions among Christians throughout church history as to exactly what the 1,000 years of Revelation 20 means. And the question boils down to how should you interpret that 1,000 years of Revelation 20 verses 1 through 10? Is that 1,000 years literal, or is that 1,000 years figurative? Is it going on at the present time, or is it yet future? And how you answer those kinds of questions will break you into different millennial categories. There are three main millennial categories. One is amillennialism. that says that the 1,000 years of Revelation 20 is symbolic of the church age, so that we are now concurrent with that 1,000 years. We're in the millennium right now, if you take the amillennial approach. A post-millennial approach says that the 1,000 years begins sometime into the church age, after the church age has gone on for a while, and then you have kind of a golden age of history where things go really well. You have the conversion of the world before the coming of Christ. And so post-millennialism looks at the 1,000 years as, well, in some cases, it began during church history, say AD 70 is one view. Others say, well, it's yet to have begun yet. And then you'll have the 1,000 years before the end of the age. That's called post-millennialism. And then there is pre-millennialism. That believes that the 1,000 years of Revelation 20 is yet future, and that the second advent comes first. The second coming of Christ comes first, and then the 1,000 years of Revelation 20. Whereas with both amillennialism and postmillennialism, the 1,000 years comes first, and then Christ comes at the end of the 1,000 years of Revelation 20. Now you might ask, why are these different positions all that important? And part of it is that whatever scheme that you adopt, whether it be amillennial, postmillennial, or premillennial, it affects how you read other passages of Scripture. And so you should be aware that there are these different systems that are out there. And again, once you kind of commit yourself to a particular system, it does affect your reading of things. Let me spell it out again a little bit clearer using some charts here that I borrowed from Clarence Veed, designed by J. Dennison. So you have, in the amillennial view, you have the death of Christ at the beginning of the present age, but then that present age is the millennium, but then Christ will return at the end of the age and have the great white throne judgment, as you'll read about at the end of Revelation 20. And then at the end of the last judgment, then will begin the new heavens and the new earth, the eternal state, after the resurrection, the general resurrection of the dead. Again, with the amillennial view, however, you start off with the death of Christ, and then the present age runs for a period of time, but then you have 1,000 years of golden age where the world will become increasingly better, the gospel will increase and advance, and gradually the world will be Christianized, not without some setbacks, but that would be the ultimate end. And that was very popular before World War I and II, though the Christianization of the world has seemed a bit more remote as certain parts of the world, like Europe, have regressed away from the gospel. But in any case, at the end of the 1,000 years, you do have then the second coming of Christ to establish, to do the last judgment, where the righteous are go into the eternal state and the wicked go into the lake of fire. And then that is followed by the new heavens and new earth of Revelation 21 and 22. That's a post-millennial approach. But then there's a couple of types of premillennial approach. The more complicated form is dispensational premillennialism. Dispensational premillennialism says that you have the death of Christ followed by the church age. But then at the end of the age, you have a 7-year period of trouble called the Great Tribulation, during which time the Antichrist will appear, and there'll be a restoration of Jews to Palestine, a conversion of a remnant of Israel. They'll rebuild the temple. The priesthood and sacrifices in the temple will be renewed, and the temple rituals restored. That'll all happen during the millennium. Also, the Antichrist figure will appear to persecute Jewish believers. And I say Jewish believers because in this view, The church is removed from the world at what is called the rapture, as described in 1 Thessalonians 4, before the Great Tribulation. But then after the Great Tribulation, Christ will come at the Battle of Armageddon, destroy the Antichrist, and usher in the Millennium, 1,000 years where Christ will rule on earth before the eternal state of Revelation 21 and 22. So the 1,000 years of Revelation 20 come after the second coming in this dispensational premillennial view. And you have that gap of 7 years between the rapture of the church and the return of Christ to establish the millennium. And then you have finally the historic premillennialism, which is also premillennial, but a simpler system. You have the death of Christ beginning the church age, but then you have a time of trouble in the end with a great apostasy and the Antichrist appearing and trouble for believers on earth. But then at the end of that time, some would say in the middle of that time, but at the end of that time, Christ comes to rapture the church so that the believers will be with him. And he doesn't just go back to heaven at that point, but continues on down to earth to establish the millennial kingdom at the end of the age. At that point, at the rapture, that's when the righteous dead are raised. At the end of the 1,000 years, the unrighteous dead will be raised as well at the great white throne judgment. But you have a more or less literal 1,000-year millennial reign of Christ. At the end of that, Satan will be loose, but then he will be put down. And then you have the last judgment following the battle of Gog and Magog as described in Revelation 21. And then after the last judgment where the wicked are judged and the righteous will then go into the eternal state, the new heavens and new earth of Revelation 21 and 22. Now, there are all kinds of arguments for and against these different millennial positions, and I'm going to choose not to go through the arguments for and against each of them here. I do have a series of videos on Christian doctrine, and if you look in the section on Christian doctrine, in the section on eschatology, I do have a discussion where I give arguments for and against each one of these millennial views, and then also for and against various tribulational views within premillennialism. And if you'd like to hear a discussion of that, I refer you to those videos, which I will also put in the notes underneath this video. Suffice to say here, though, is I just want to show that how interpretation of Revelation 20 can determine how you interpret many other passages, especially passages in the prophets. In particular, those that tend to be premillennial will tend to interpret prophecies in the prophets, both Old Testament prophets as well as Book of Revelation. They will tend to interpret them more literally, whereas amillennialists and post-millennialists will be less literal in their interpretation of prophecy. One example of this is in Isaiah chapter 65. In Isaiah 65, there is a passage that talks about a coming new heaven and new earth, language that seems to echo Revelation 21 and 22 to some degree. But it says about that time in the new heaven and new earth that in Isaiah 65 and verse 20, which by the way is in a eschatological passage of Isaiah that's talking about the distant future as far as we're concerned as well. But anyway, it says in 65:20 that in that new heavens and new earth, quote, no longer will there be an infant who lives but a few days, or an old man who does not live out his days, for the youth will die at the age of 100, and the one who does not reach the age of 100 shall be thought accursed. Well, it turns out that premillennialists and amills and postmills will interpret those words somewhat differently. Premillennialists will say, well, we should take that language literally, and that means that there's going to be death in this time. And they would place this as the first stage of the age to come, what they would call the Millennium, in which people will live extraordinarily long lives. If you die at 100, you would be considered to have died young, but there will be death. And so people will live extraordinarily long lives, but it'll be a time of blessedness within those parameters where there is still death. Whereas amills and postmills will tend to see this as understatement. In fact, if you pick up the language of new heaven and new earth in Revelation 21 and 22, in the fulfillment, there's no death at all. So if hypothetically you were to die at 100, you would have said to have died young, but in fact, nobody dies in the new heavens and the new earth. And so premillennialists have a place to have this transitional period where people can live extraordinarily long lives, but still be mortals. Amillennialists don't have a place to put that in their eschatology, and so they interpret it non-literally. And so that's just an illustration of how the eschatological system, the millennial system that you adopt before you read prophetic texts, can affect how you interpret prophecy. So that's my discussion of apocalyptic, the hermeneutics of apocalyptic. And my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle.